An ordinary ceremony took an unexpected turn when Prince George reportedly witnessed a guard being taunted. What followed has left royal insiders buzzing. Did the young heir break protocol or show early signs of leadership? The truth might surprise you. Keep watching and be sure to subscribe for more royal scoops. Just when the crowd was settling in for the iconic changing of the guard, something unexpected began to unfold. Tourists had gathered in excitement, cameras ready, anticipation buzzing in the air. But not everyone came with respect. Among the visitors, a small group stood out. Not for admiration, but for disruption. They weren't just excited, they were pushing boundaries, laughing loudly, and mocking the ceremony. It started with jokes and impersonations, but it quickly turned inappropriate. What the group didn't realize, a young royal, Prince George, was quietly watching nearby, and what he was about to do would shift the entire energy of that morning. One step, one decision, and everything would change. But what led him to act so boldly? Keep watching to find out. This ceremony wasn't just another tourist attraction. It was a deeply rooted tradition, carried out with pride by trained soldiers who took their duties seriously. But to this particular group, it looked more like a comedy show. They laughed as the guards moved in perfect synchronization. One man especially stood out. Bright yellow shirt, loud voice, camera in hand. He started barking fake commands, pretending to be part of the act. His friends cheered him on, fueling the chaos. Around them, other tourists started to shift uncomfortably. Security watched closely, but their priority was the crowd as a whole. Still, it was clear. The atmosphere had changed. This wasn't harmless fun anymore, and someone was about to make a move no one saw coming. From his viewing spot inside the palace grounds, Prince George had a perfect view of everything. At 11 years old, he'd already seen glimpses of royal life. But this was different. He stood quietly, hands clasped, watching as the ceremony unfolded with pride. But then, his gaze fixed on the disruptive group, the laughter, the yelling. It didn't sit right with him. This wasn't part of the tradition his parents had taught him to respect. His face changed. Confusion turned into concern. He glanced at the guard being mocked. The man stood firm, unmoving, just as he was trained. But something told George that what was happening wasn't just rude, it was wrong. And even though no one had asked him to act, something in him said he had to. The guard being taunted that morning was a young soldier named James Thompson. Like every other ceremonial guard, he had trained for this exact kind of moment. Disruption wasn't new. Tourists often tested their patience. But this felt different. The words being thrown at him were personal, almost cruel. Still, he stood his ground. No movement, no reaction. His duty was to remain composed, a living symbol of tradition and discipline. But inside, he later admitted it was one of the hardest moments he'd faced. He couldn't respond. He couldn't defend himself. All he could do was wait for it to pass, or for someone else to intervene. And just as things began to escalate further, someone, broke the pattern. Without a word to his protection officer, George quietly stepped forward. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was calm, steady, purposeful. Every adult nearby immediately took notice. Security snapped to attention. His protection officer moved close, whispering into his radio. This wasn't planned. But George didn't pause. His face showed focus, not fear. As he approached the group, heads began to turn. People whispered, "Is that?" The boy's small frame seemed to carry unexpected authority, and in that moment, George wasn't acting like a schoolboy. The man in the yellow shirt paused, confused. Here was this young boy, calm, composed, and looking him straight in the eye. For a second, no one moved. The man didn't even realize who he was talking to. Then George spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "He's a real soldier," he said. Simple words, but they carried weight. He explained, politely but firmly, that mocking someone who couldn't speak back wasn't fair. He talked about the years of tradition, the meaning of the uniform, and the discipline it took to stand still through it all. The man blinked, caught off guard. Around them, the noise of the crowd faded. People leaned in. The disrespectful laughter stopped. And just like that, the energy shifted. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. "Is that Prince George?" someone asked. "What's going on?" Cameras that once pointed at the guards were now turning toward the boy calmly standing his ground. The other tourists in the group took a step back, suddenly unsure of themselves. The man in yellow, now clearly embarrassed, tried to laugh it off. But it didn't work. George wasn't there to humiliate him. He just wanted him to understand. And somehow, he did. The man muttered an apology, and the tension in the air started to ease. What could have turned into a messy scene had been completely turned around. Not by shouting, not by force, but by the quiet courage of a child who knew what was right. Though George's actions had calmed things down, the royal security team didn't take any chances. Within moments, more personnel arrived discreetly, positioning themselves nearby without alarming the public. Their priority was clear: protect the young prince at all costs. But they quickly realized there was no need to intervene. George had already handled it. His presence, his words, had resolved the issue better than any official could. The guard commander, watching from nearby, approached to assess the situation. He didn't need to give orders. What could have been an escalation had been turned into a moment of clarity and respect. George hadn't acted out of authority. He'd acted out of empathy, and that made all the difference. Back at the palace, when Prince William and Princess Catherine were informed of the incident, their first reaction was concern. George had stepped away from his detail, something no royal child is expected to do. But as the full story came in, their concern shifted. What their son had done wasn't reckless. It was thoughtful. Prince William, with his own military background, understood exactly how much that moment meant to the guard. Princess Catherine saw something else, a reflection of the values they'd worked hard to teach: kindness, respect, and quiet strength. Far from disapproval, they felt proud. Their son hadn't just witnessed tradition, he had stood up for it, and in doing so, he showed a glimpse of the man he might become. Initially, the palace chose not to speak publicly about the event. Reports were quietly documented, internal reviews were held, security assessments were updated. After all, this wasn't part of any plan. But in time, word began to spread. A whisper here, a quiet mention there, and soon it was no longer just a palace secret. It was a story making its way to the public. What caught people's attention wasn't just that George had spoken up, it was how he'd done it, calmly, respectfully, without trying to shame or confront. The story had power because it was real, and once it reached the public, it sparked something much larger than a few headlines. The reaction from the public was overwhelming. Social media lit up with praise for the young prince. People called him brave, compassionate, and wise beyond his years. Veterans shared personal stories, recalling times they too had faced mockery in uniform. They applauded George for doing something they wished more people would: speak up. Teachers used the story in classrooms to teach empathy and courage. Parents shared it with their kids as an example of how one small voice can make a big difference. And something interesting happened at royal ceremonies after that. More respect, fewer interruptions, more understanding. One moment, one quiet voice had created a ripple effect far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. Those who knew George closely said something changed in him after that day. He wasn't boastful. He didn't bring it up unless asked, but his sense of responsibility grew. He started asking deeper questions about ceremonies and their meaning. He became more engaged in his royal duties, not just as tasks, but as traditions with purpose. The palace staff noticed it too. The guards began greeting him with genuine appreciation. There was a new sense of connection. For the first time, George wasn't just the future king. He was someone who had earned their respect, and he seemed to carry that with him, not as a badge of honor, but as a quiet reminder of the kind of person he wanted to be. While the outcome had been positive, palace officials took the event seriously. It led to a reevaluation of how young royals were prepared for public events. New guidelines were introduced, helping them understand when to step forward and when to call for help. The goal wasn't to restrict instinct, but to protect safety while nurturing moral courage. Security teams also received updated training, learning how to recognize when guards might be experiencing verbal harassment and how to respond without causing disruption. The balance between tradition, protocol, and humanity became clearer. George's actions had opened a conversation, and while the moment hadn't been planned, it taught everyone involved something important about leadership, especially the kind that begins with empathy. This wasn't just about one child speaking up, it was about the message behind that act. George's quiet intervention reminded people everywhere that kindness doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. It showed that courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just doing the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. And it reminded the world that respect for tradition must go hand in hand with respect for people. In that small moment, George didn't act like a prince because of his title. He acted like a leader because of his character. And that may be one of the clearest signs yet of the kind of king he could one day become. So what do you think? If you had been in Prince George's shoes, would you have stepped forward? Or maybe you've seen something similar? Someone being mocked, misunderstood, or mistreated, and wondered if you should speak up. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter, and they could inspire someone else to find their voice. And if this kind of content connects with you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We've got more stories coming, untold moments, surprising truths, and powerful examples of character in action. Because sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest lessons. Don't miss what's next.